Welcome to Business Review, a daily program that delves into the latest and most significant economic stories. From stock markets to currency news, Business Review covers the most up-to-date stories in the global financial world.
South Africa Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has warned that Africa's most industrialized economy is on the verge of a debt crisis and its biggest contraction in almost a century as the country's coronavirus epidemic gathers pace. The finance minister said in an emergency budget update to lawmakers on Wednesday that the South African economy is likely to contract more than 7% this year because of the pandemic, and a fiscal reckoning looms if the country does not control its debts. The minister stressed South Africa's budget deficit projection for 2020 through 2021 has more than doubled to about 15% of gross domestic product, adding that public debt will surge to 4/5 of GDP, compared with an earlier forecast of 2/3, as gross tax revenues missed their target by $17 billion. Minister Mboweni pledged to close the budget deficit by 2024 and to find 250 billion rand of spending cuts in the next 2 years. The government's borrowing will more than double this year to 777 billion rand, according to the South African Treasury. To cushion the economic blow of the pandemic, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a 500 billion rand relief package in April, equivalent to 10% of South Africa's GDP. The rand extended losses on the day in response to the budget.
Spain's King Felipe and Queen Letizia arrived in Gran Canaria on Tuesday, the 23rd June, where they kicked off their 3-day tour to support the country's tourism sector, which came to a halt over 3 months due to the pandemic. Spain normally attracts 80 million tourists a year, with tourism providing more than 12% of the country's GDP. Opening up the holiday market again before the summer season is over is seen as crucial to the economy. The royals scheduled a visit to the Gran Canaria and Tenerife and then fly on to the Balearic Islands on June the 25th. They arranged to visit landmarks and meet members of the tourism sector in both the Canary and Balearic Islands, where tourism generates over 30% of the GDP of the islands.
And develop more than 13.33 hectares of fruit-bearing forest. The village also plans to renovate an abandoned silver mine into an ecotourism destination, which will benefit the locals in a sustainable and stable way, relying on green industry. At present, each of the 8 poor villages in Boto County has a poverty alleviation team, which helps alleviate poverty in all aspects, from industrial development to relocating impoverished residents from inhospitable areas.
Parisian nurse Justine Debris, aged 29, gathered on June the 16th with thousands of people near the French Health Ministry to demand better working conditions and salaries. Debris has worked at Robert Debré Hospital, mostly taking care of children, for the past 8 years. During the peak of the virus in France, she worked for a week in a makeshift intensive care service unit at the Robert Debré Hospital, which stayed running for 3 weeks. Debris hopes that the pandemic highlighted the need for a stop to cost-cutting and that there will be most investment in hiring staff and better equipment and wages. In recognition of their contribution during COVID crisis, the government paid frontliners healthcare workers a €1,500 bonus. For weeks, people came onto their balconies every evening at 8 p.m. to applaud careers. But for Debris, these felt like empty gestures. Her basic pay is around €1,900 per month, only €200 more than she earned when she first started in nursing 8 years ago. She said staffing levels were such that she and her colleagues had to rush through shifts and could not give patients the attention they needed. Unions had called for national strikes and protests as a forum baptized the Ségur de la Santé was launched on May the 25th by the French government to shape a new plan for hospitals by mid-July.
Western and Arab countries pledged a total of $1.8 billion in aid to Sudan on Thursday to help the struggling African nation. The pledges from 40 countries, including an additional $400 million in grants from the World Bank, came during a video conference co-hosted by Germany, marking the formal launch of the international community's financial support for Sudan's democratic transition. The European Union pledged $350.13 million, the United States $356.2 million, Germany €150 million, France €100 million, and Britain £150 million for humanitarian and development programs. Chief among them planned cash transfers to poor families with the help of the World Bank. Inflation topped an annual 100% last month, and Sudan's currency has plunged to 141 to the dollar, compared to 55 at the official rate. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for massive aid, saying the region needed a stable and democratic Sudan. Drastic shortages of basic goods nationwide have generated deep frustration, forcing people to line up for hours to buy bread or get fuel. Many of Thursday's pledges will be used to fund an ambitious $1.9 billion cash transfer program to Sudan's neediest families, around 80% of the population, over the course of 2 years.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, on Friday, June the 26th, opened its 36th summit, which is chaired by Vietnam via video conference, focusing on COVID-19's response, post-pandemic recovery, and further cooperation with partners. The Vietnamese Prime Minister said the ASEAN leaders discussed the region's comprehensive post-pandemic recovery plans, implementing initiatives including establishment the ASEAN COVID-19 response, setting up a reserve for medical supplies, and building standard procedures of epidemic response in case of a health emergency. The ASEAN leaders conducted the midterm review of the implementation of blueprints under the ASEAN Community Vision 2025, provided feedback on evaluating the enforcement of the Charter. Established in 1967, ASEAN groups Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. The 36th summit had been scheduled for April in central Vietnam's Da Nang, but was postponed due to the pandemic.
The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge visited 2 independent businesses to see how they have been impacted by coronavirus and how they are returning to a new normal now that lockdown measures are easing. On June 19th, the Duke of Cambridge visited Smith's, the bakers, who have been serving King's Lynn for 50 years, and reopened their bakery shop on Monday after 11 weeks of closure. The Duke spoke to the owners of the bakery along with members of staff about how the coronavirus restrictions have impacted on the family-run business, with 80% of the company's wholesale customers having to close their own operations. He heard how the business had to furlough a number of staff members, but also how it adapted its business model during lockdown by operating a delivery service to local residents and selling new lines of products to meet the demand for baking ingredients such as flour and sugar. Meanwhile, on June 18th, the Duchess of Cambridge visited Frankenham Garden Centre, where she met the centre's owners before speaking to staff members. The family business was closed for 7 weeks before reopening for business on 15th of May. The Duchess heard more about the measures which the garden centre has implemented to ensure that customers are able to visit and shop safely. Report 36. The U.S. Commerce Department announced that it will allow American companies to work with Chinese technology company Huawei on setting standards for 5G telecom networks. Since Huawei was placed on the U.S. Entity List in May 2019, American companies have been required to obtain a special license from the Commerce Department to have any business dealings with Huawei and its affiliates. This rule change allows the companies to disclose U.S. technologies to the Chinese telecom giant without a license if it is for the purpose of 5G standards development. Huawei has welcomed the U.S. decision, saying in a statement that it will continue to hold sincere discussions with its counterparts, including those in the U.S. In the telecommunications industry, 5G or fifth-generation wireless networks are expected to power everything from high-speed video transmissions to self-driving cars.
This has been Business Review, your daily source for the most critical stories in the financial world. Tune in next time for the latest financial news impacting the world economy.